"Mom, stay here for a minute. We'll be right back," my son said, his voice calm, almost casual, like we were stopping for coffee instead of standing in the middle of a forest miles from the nearest road. I remember nodding, because that's what I've always done when Daniel speaks, trusted him without question. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the late afternoon light filtered through the trees in long, golden streaks. Henry shifted beside me, adjusting his jacket, already looking a little tired from the walk. "They won't be long," he murmured, more to reassure me than himself. I watched the direction they'd gone, listening for footsteps, for laughter, for anything that would signal this was still just a family outing. But minutes stretched. 5, 10, 20. The silence began to feel heavier, pressing in around us. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. No signal, just a blank screen where the bars should have been. "That's strange," I said quietly, though something deeper inside me had already begun to stir. Henry looked at me, his brows knitting together. Maybe they just went a little farther than they said. I nodded again, but my eyes stayed fixed on the path. Daniel had chosen this place. Lisa had insisted it was beautiful, peaceful, a perfect spot to unplug. I remember how she smiled when she said that. At the time, I thought it was thoughtful. Now, standing there with the quiet stretching into something unnatural, that smile replayed in my mind differently. Too polished, too certain. I tried calling anyway. The phone didn't even ring. It was as if the world beyond those trees had simply disappeared. Another 10 minutes passed, or maybe it was 30. Time felt slippery out there. Henry sat down on a fallen log, exhaling slowly. "Margaret," he said, his voice softer now, "something doesn't feel right." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around more carefully, noticing details I'd missed before. The way the trail behind us wasn't clearly marked. The way there hadn't been another person in sight since we arrived. The way Daniel had taken the car keys with him, even though he said he'd only be gone a minute. A cold realization settled into my chest, slow and deliberate. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was intention. I felt it in the stillness, in the absence of everything that should have been there. I took a step forward, then stopped. The forest seemed to watch back, silent and patient. And for the first time in my 72 years, I understood something I never thought I would have to face. My own son wasn't coming back. I stood there for a long moment after that thought settled in, as if saying it out loud inside my own mind might somehow make it less true. But the silence only deepened around us, stretching wider, colder, until even the sound of the wind through the trees felt distant and hollow, like it belonged to another place entirely. Henry tried to stand again, but his knees trembled, and he sat back down heavily on the log, pressing his hand against his chest as if steadying himself. "Maybe they lost their way," he said, though his voice lacked conviction, and I realized he was holding on to the same fragile hope I had just let go of. I walked a few steps toward the path where Daniel and Lisa had disappeared, scanning the ground for footprints, for any sign of movement. But the forest floor was covered in dry needles and fallen leaves that revealed nothing. It was as if they had never been there at all. I turned slowly, taking in our surroundings with a clarity that had not been there before. The trees were taller than I had noticed earlier, their branches weaving together overhead and dimming the light as the sun began its slow descent. The air had cooled noticeably, and I could feel it seeping through my jacket, settling into my bones. We had not brought water. No extra clothing. No map. I remembered how I had asked, half joking, if we should pack more supplies, and how Lisa had laughed lightly and said, "It is just a short walk. Margaret, do not worry so much." At the time, I had smiled, embarrassed by my own caution. Now that memory felt different, sharper, like a piece of glass turning in my chest. I checked my phone again, though I already knew what it would show. Nothing. No signal. No missed calls. No messages. Just the faint reflection of my own face staring back at me from the dark screen, older than I remembered, more tired. Henry shifted again, his breathing slower now, and I moved quickly back to him, kneeling beside him and placing my hand over his. His skin felt colder than it should have. "We need to keep moving," I said quietly, though I was not sure in which direction. "We cannot stay here." He looked at me, searching my face, perhaps hoping to find certainty there, but I had none to give. All I had was a growing awareness that every step we took from this moment forward would matter. I helped him to his feet, steadying him as we turned in the direction that felt most familiar, though even that sense of direction was uncertain now. As we began to walk, slow and careful, I could not stop the thoughts from coming. Daniel had been distant for months. Short phone calls, missed visits, excuses that always seemed reasonable at the time. And Lisa, always polite, always smiling, but never quite warm. There had been conversations that stopped when I entered the room, decisions made without asking us, small changes that I had dismissed as part of life moving forward. Now, each of those moments returned with a different meaning, fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. The deeper we moved into the trees, the quieter it became, until even our footsteps sounded too loud in the stillness. And somewhere in that silence, beneath the fear and the confusion, something else began to take shape inside me. Not panic. Not yet. Something colder. Something clearer. If they had truly left us here, then this was not the end of a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something far more deliberate. We walked for what felt like miles, though I knew it could not have been more than half a mile at most. Each step slow and measured as I kept my arm around Henry to steady him, his weight leaning more heavily against me with every passing minute. The ground beneath us was uneven, scattered with roots and loose stones, and more than once I had to pause to help him regain his balance. The light above us continued to fade, the golden glow of late afternoon giving way to a dim gray that made the forest feel even more closed in, as if the trees themselves were drawing tighter around us. "Margaret," Henry said quietly, his voice thinner now. "We should have heard something by now." I did not answer right away because there was nothing left to say that would not make the truth more real. Instead, I focused on listening, not just for Daniel and Lisa, but for anything. A distant road, a passing car, another person. But there was nothing. No distant hum of traffic. No voices. Only the soft, steady rhythm of the wind moving through branches high above us. That was when I noticed something else. The path we were following did not feel like a path anymore. It narrowed gradually until it disappeared altogether, blending into the surrounding forest as if it had never truly existed. I stopped walking and turned slowly in a full circle, trying to orient myself, but every direction looked the same. Tall trees, dark trunks, layers of shadow. "We need to go back," Henry said, though even as he spoke the words, I could hear the uncertainty behind them. Back to where? Back to what? I looked down at the ground, searching again for any sign of where we had come from, but the leaves and pine needles had shifted under our feet, erasing whatever trail we might have left behind. That was when a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Earlier that day, before we left the house, Daniel had been unusually quiet. He barely looked at me when I spoke, his responses short, distracted. I had asked if everything was all right, and he had forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Lisa had answered for him, her voice smooth, reassuring, explaining that he was just tired from work. At the time, I had accepted that explanation because it was easier than questioning it. Now, standing in the middle of a forest with no clear way out, that moment returned with a different weight. It was not tiredness. It was distance. Deliberate distance. I felt it again now, not just in the memory, but in the space around us. The absence of them was too complete, too final. Henry stumbled slightly, and I tightened my grip on his arm, guiding him toward a nearby tree where he could rest for a moment. His breathing had grown more labored, each inhale shallow, each exhale slower than the last. I crouched beside him, brushing a bit of dirt from his sleeve, more out of instinct than necessity. "We will figure this out," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my thoughts were beginning to sharpen into something far less forgiving than fear. Because the more I replayed the day in my mind, the clearer it became. The choice of location, the lack of preparation, the way Daniel had not looked back when he walked away. These were not random details. They were decisions. And decisions, once made, do not simply disappear. I stood again, scanning the trees, and that was when I felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, something else. A presence, subtle but undeniable, as if somewhere beyond the line of trees, just out of sight, someone was there, watching, waiting. And for the first time since we had been left behind, I realized that we might not be as alone as I had thought. I did not move right away after that feeling settled in, because I was not certain if it was instinct or imagination, And at my age, I have learned the difference matters, but not always in the way people think. Sometimes instinct is quiet. It does not shout. It does not panic. It simply waits for you to notice it. I turned my head slowly, careful not to startle Henry, and let my eyes drift across the trees instead of focusing on any one point. The forest looked the same as it had moments before, still and layered in shadow. But now there was something beneath that stillness, something that did not belong to the wind or the fading light. Henry shifted slightly against the trunk, his eyes half closed. "Margaret," he said softly, "we should rest a bit longer." I nodded, even though my attention had already shifted elsewhere. "Just for a minute," I replied, keeping my voice even. I did not want him to feel what I was beginning to sense. Not yet. I stood there, listening again, but not for footsteps this time. For intention. For presence. And then I saw it. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough. A subtle change between two trees about 30 yards away. A shape that did not move. With the wind. A stillness within stillness. I did not react. I did not call out. Instead, I let my gaze pass over it as if I had seen nothing. The same way I had done countless times in my life, when something uncomfortable revealed itself too early. You learn, after a certain age, that reacting too quickly can cost you more than silence ever will. I turned back to Henry and adjusted his jacket, brushing off a few pine needles that had settled on his shoulder. My hands were steady, even though my thoughts were not. Someone was there, watching us, not approaching, not helping, just observing. The question was not whether they existed. The question was why they had not stepped forward. I glanced once more toward the trees, this time only from the corner of my eye, and the shape was still there. Unmoving. Patient. A strange calm began to settle over me, replacing the earlier uncertainty. Because if someone had been watching us long enough to remain hidden, then they had also seen something else. They had seen Daniel leave. They had seen the car disappear. They had seen the moment we were left behind. That realization changed everything. I was no longer thinking only about survival. I was thinking about evidence. About witnesses. About truth that could not be denied. Henry reached for my hand, his grip weaker now, but still familiar. "We will be all right," he said, as if saying it might make it real. I squeezed his hand gently. "Yes," I answered, my voice quieter than before, but more certain. Not because I believed we were safe, but because I understood something new. We were not invisible. And sometimes, being seen is more powerful than being rescued. I lifted my head slightly, not enough to challenge the presence in the trees, but enough to acknowledge it in my own way. Whoever was out there had chosen to remain silent. And for now, I would do the same. Because silence, I was beginning to realize, was no longer weakness. It was strategy. I stayed beside Henry a little longer than necessary, not because he needed the rest, but because I needed the time to think clearly, to let everything settle into place without rushing into a decision that could cost us more than we had already lost. The air had grown colder, and the light continued to fade, turning the forest into a deeper shade of gray that made distances harder to judge and shapes less certain. I adjusted Henry's collar again, my hands moving slowly, deliberately, as if everything were still normal, as if we were simply pausing during a long walk and not standing at the edge of something far more serious. "We should move before it gets darker," I said quietly, helping him to his feet once more. He nodded, though his steps were slower now, his strength clearly fading. I did not look directly toward the place where I had seen the figure, but I remained aware of it, the same way you remain aware of a presence in a room even when you are not facing it. If they were still there, and I believe they were, then they were watching what we did next. That meant every movement mattered. We began walking again, this time more carefully, choosing a direction that followed a slight slope downward, hoping it might lead us toward water or at least a clearer path. The ground became softer beneath our feet, and I noticed faint impressions that could have been tracks, though it was impossible to tell how old they were or who had left them. Still, it was something, and something was better than nothing. Henry leaned more heavily on me now, his breathing uneven, and I slowed our pace to match his strength. "You always did think ahead," he said after a while, his voice carrying a faint attempt at warmth. I allowed myself a small smile, though it did not reach my eyes. "Not always," I replied, "because if I had, we would not be here." The thought passed quickly, replaced by something more focused. I needed to stay clear, observant, present. The forest around us seemed to shift as we moved, the sounds changing subtly, the silence no longer empty but layered, as if holding things just beyond reach. And then I heard it. Not a voice, not a word, but a faint sound that did not belong to us. A step, perhaps, or the slight movement of something brushing against a branch. I did not stop walking, but my senses sharpened instantly, every detail pulling into focus. Whoever was there was still there, still keeping their distance, still choosing not to reveal themselves. That choice, more than anything, told me this was not random. This was controlled, intentional. I tightened my hold on Henry and continued forward, my mind already adjusting to this new reality. We were not just trying to find our way out. We were being observed while we did it. And somewhere in that realization, a quiet determination began to form, stronger than fear, steadier than doubt. Because if someone had decided to watch instead of walk away, then this story was not finished yet. Not for us, and certainly not for the ones who had left us behind. The sound came again, clearer this time, not loud but deliberate, like someone shifting their weight just enough to remind me they were still there. And I felt Henry tense slightly beside me, as if he had sensed it too. Though he said nothing, his energy too low to question what he could not fully understand. I slowed our pace even more, careful not to appear alarmed, guiding him toward a cluster of trees where the ground leveled out slightly, giving us a moment to pause without making it obvious that I had heard something unusual. "Let us stop here for a second," I said softly, helping him sit against the base of a wide trunk, its roots rising from the earth like natural supports. He nodded gratefully, closing his eyes for a moment as he steadied his breathing. I remained standing, my back partially turned to the direction of the sound, as if I were simply watching the fading light rather than listening for movement behind us. The forest had grown quieter in a different way now, not empty, but attentive, as if something within it had shifted its focus entirely onto us. I let a few seconds pass, then spoke, my voice calm and measured. "We know you are there," I said, not loudly, not demanding, just enough to carry through the stillness. Henry's eyes opened slowly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he did not interrupt. For a moment, nothing changed. The trees remained still, the air unmoved. I almost wondered if I had imagined it all, if the exhaustion and tension had begun to play tricks on my mind. And then, from between the same two trees I had noticed earlier, a figure stepped forward, not suddenly, not in a way meant to startle, but with a quiet, controlled movement that suggested they had already decided this moment would come. He was a man, perhaps in his late 40s, dressed in neutral outdoor clothing that blended easily with the surroundings, his posture relaxed but alert. He kept a respectful distance, far enough not to invade our space, close enough to be seen clearly. "I did not want to frighten you," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle, carrying the tone of someone used to being careful with their words. I studied him for a moment before responding, noting the way he held himself, the way his eyes moved between Henry and me, assessing, but not threatening. "You have been watching us," I said, not as a question, but as a fact. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without hesitation. "Yes," he replied. There was no apology in his voice, but there was something else. Awareness. Responsibility, perhaps. I felt Henry shift beside me, his hand reaching for mine again, and I squeezed it gently, grounding him, grounding myself. "Then you saw what happened," I continued, keeping my tone even, though the weight of that statement carried far more than the words themselves. The man did not answer immediately, but his silence said enough. He had seen everything. The car leaving, the absence that followed, the choice that had been made. And in that moment, standing in the quiet space between us, I realized something important. This was no longer just our story to tell. It had been witnessed. And once something is seen clearly, it cannot be undone. He did not rush his answer, and that told me more than any immediate explanation could have, because people who lie often fill silence too quickly, while those who hold the truth tend to measure it before they speak. "I saw enough," he said finally, his voice steady, his eyes meeting mine without hesitation. There was no curiosity in his expression, no surprise, only a quiet certainty that settled heavily into the space between us. Henry shifted again beside me, his grip tightening slightly, as if the confirmation made everything more real for him than it already was. I could feel the weight of his trust in my hand, the unspoken question of what came next. I did not look at him yet. I kept my focus on the man in front of us. And you chose to stay hidden, I said, not accusing, but not ignoring it either. He nodded once, accepting the statement without defense. I needed to be sure, he replied. People do not always see clearly in moments like this. I had to understand what I was looking at. His words were careful, deliberate, and I could tell he had been observing for longer than I at first thought. Not just the moment we were left behind, but perhaps even before that. I considered that for a second, then asked the question that mattered most. Do you have a way out of here? It was not a plea. It was a practical step forward. He studied me for a brief moment, as if weighing something unseen, then nodded again. My cabin is about a mile from here, he said. It is not much, but it is warm, and there is water. I felt Henry's hand tighten slightly at the word warm, and I knew we could not stay where we were much longer, not with the temperature dropping and his strength fading. Still, I did not move right away. You said you saw enough? I continued, my voice even. Did you record it? There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of recognition. He understood exactly why I was asking. Slowly, he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small device, no larger than the palm of his hand. Trail camera, he said. I use them out here. Motion activated. I checked the footage when I realized something was wrong. He did not need to explain further. I understood. Evidence. Clear. Objective. Not something that could be dismissed or rewritten. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, not from relief, but from clarity. The situation had shifted. We were no longer just two people lost in the forest. There was a record now, a witness that did not rely on memory or emotion. Henry looked up at me, searching my face again, and this time I met his eyes. We are going with him, I said. Softly. He nodded without question, trusting me as he always had. I turned back to the man and gave a slight nod of my own. Lead the way, I said. He did not waste time. He stepped back, creating space for us to follow, his movements calm and purposeful. I helped Henry to his feet once more, steadying him as we began to walk behind the man, deeper into the trees, but now with direction, with intention. The forest no longer felt endless. It felt contained, mapped by someone who knew it well. And as we moved forward, I allowed myself one final glance behind us, toward the place where we had been left. It looked no different than any other part of the forest. Quiet, still, ordinary. But I knew better now, because what had happened there would not remain hidden. Not anymore. The walk felt longer than a mile, not because of the distance, but because of the weight of everything that had shifted in such a short time. Each step forward carrying us further away from the confusion we had been left in and closer to something far more defined, something that had structure and direction. The man moved with quiet confidence, navigating the terrain without hesitation, occasionally glancing back just enough to make sure we were still following. I stayed close to Henry, adjusting my pace to match his, supporting him when the ground became uneven, though I could feel a subtle change in him now. It was not strength returning, not yet, but something steadier, a sense that we were no longer alone in uncertainty. The trees began to thin slightly, and the air shifted, carrying with it a faint scent of wood and something warmer, something that did not belong to the forest itself. We are close, the man said, his voice low but certain, and a few steps later I saw it. The cabin was modest, tucked between the trees as if it had always been part of them, its structure simple but solid, with a small porch and a single window glowing faintly from within. It was not large, not impressive, but it was real, and in that moment, that was enough. He stepped ahead of us, opening the door and gesturing for us to enter first. I guided Henry inside, the warmth meeting us immediately, wrapping around us in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after the cold outside. The space was clean and functional, a small table, a chair, a narrow bed, and a stove that radiated steady heat. I helped Henry sit, then moved just enough to take in the room, noting everything without appearing to do so. Habit. Awareness. The man closed the door behind us, the sound soft but final, separating us from the forest and everything it held. There is water on the counter, he said, stepping aside to give us space. I poured a glass and handed it to Henry first, watching as he drank slowly, his hands steadier now. Only then did I allow myself a small sip, the simple act grounding me more than I expected. The man reached into his pocket again and placed the small device on the table, not pushing it toward me, just setting it down where it could be seen. "It is all here," he said quietly. I looked at it, then at him, understanding that this moment was not about urgency, but about choice. "We will look at it," I replied, my voice calm, controlled. "Not yet. Not until Henry was fully settled. Not until I was ready to see it without reacting." He nodded, respecting that boundary without question. The room fell into a brief silence, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, as if everything that needed to be said had already been acknowledged. I moved closer to Henry, adjusting the blanket the man had placed over the chair, draping it across his shoulders. His eyes met mine again, clearer now, more present. "You knew," he said softly, not asking, just stating. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "I suspected," I answered. There was a difference, and that difference mattered. I turned my attention back to the device on the table, the quiet weight of it pulling my focus. Because whatever was inside it would not just confirm what had happened. It would define what came next. I waited until Henry's breathing had steadied and the warmth had fully reached his hands before I moved toward the table. Because some moments should not be rushed, and this was one of them. Not because I feared what I would see, but because I understood that once I saw it, everything would become final. The man remained near the door, giving us space without leaving entirely, as if he knew his role was not finished yet. I reached for the device slowly, turning it over in my hand, feeling its weight, its quiet significance. Something so small, and yet it carried more truth than words ever could. I set it down again, pressed the button, and watched as the screen came to life. The footage began without sound, just a steady frame of the forest, familiar and distant at the same time. Then, after a few seconds, we appeared. Henry and I, walking behind Daniel and Lisa, just as I remembered. I watched my own posture, my own expression, searching for something I might have missed in that moment. But there was nothing. Just trust. Unquestioned trust. The footage continued, showing Daniel stopping, turning slightly, saying something I could not hear, but I already knew the words. I watched him gesture, watched us pause, watched him and Lisa walk away. And then I watched something I had not seen before. Daniel looked back. Not once, but twice. The first time was brief, almost automatic. The second time was different. Slower, deliberate, as if confirming something. Then he turned away again and kept walking, never to return. I felt something settle inside me, not shock, not even anger, but a clarity so sharp it left no room for doubt. This had not been hesitation. It had been choice. The footage ended there, the frame returning to stillness, the same empty forest that had surrounded us. I turned off the device and placed it back on the table, my hands steady, my mind already moving forward. Henry watched me closely, his eyes searching for a reaction I was not going to give. "It is clear," I said simply. He nodded, as if he had already known. The man near the door spoke quietly. "I can take you to the nearest road in the morning. There is a ranger station about 5 miles from here." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his offer. "That will be enough," I replied, because I did not need more than that. Not now. The rest would come later, in places where things were recorded differently, where words were written down, where actions had consequences that could not be avoided. I walked to the small window and looked out into the darkness, the forest no longer something unknown, but something that had revealed exactly what it needed to. Somewhere beyond those trees was the life we had left behind, the house, the conversations, the familiar routines. And within that life were two people who believed they had closed a chapter without witness, without consequence. I allowed myself a small, quiet breath, not of relief, but of understanding. They had not removed us. They had revealed themselves. And that was something they could never take back.